U.S Brazil Relations. Historical background. Brazil declared its independence from Portugal in 1822. The United States was the first foreign country to recognize Brazil in 1824. This set the stage for good relations between the two countries. A year earlier, the Monroe Doctrine was declared by President James Monroe. In 1823, in delivering an address to Congress, President Monroe basically declared that Western Hemisphere would be the province of the United States. That is to say, the United States would be the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. And specifically, European powers were to have no new colonies in this hemisphere, and in return, the United States would stay out of direct intervention in Europe. U.S. relations with Brazil have generally been quite positive. I think there's a combination of specific reasons as to why this was the case. Brazil is very large by territory and population. At the same time, Brazil is very far geographically from the United States. And Brazil never had a communist government or a very left-leaning government that sympathized with or closely cooperated with any communist governments. Nor has Brazilian government ever threatened American property interests in Brazil or elsewhere. I think it's a combination of these three reasons, and not any one of these reasons alone, that has led to a relatively good relationship between the United States and Brazil. If you look at other Latin American countries, particularly countries of Central America, you see that the United States constantly intervened in the affairs of many of them, and interventions included both economic and direct military interventions. This was not the case with Brazil because of the combination of these three reasons. Economic prospects of Brazil. Brazil became energy independent in 2006. This was quite a feat, considering that by then already Brazil was nearing 200 million people. For a country of such enormous size, achieving energy independence in the 21st century is quite remarkable. Now, one of the reasons why Brazil was able to do so was because they switched most of their cars and light trucks to ethanol fuel. Ethanol is alcohol-based fuel. This allowed Brazil to significantly reduce the purchases of oil from foreign countries. And so by 2006, it was importing as much oil and petroleum-based products as it was exporting. So it was doing both, importing and exporting. And by 2006, the number of oil and oil-based imports and exports evened out. So that meant that Brazil was energy independent. In 2007, vast new oil reserves were discovered in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Brazil. This allowed Brazil to become a significant exporter of oil. Brazil is rich in many natural resources, and it exports many of them. Crude oil is just one of these resources. It also exports iron ore, soybeans, sugar, and poultry. Rapid economic growth in China and India, particularly during the first 8 to 9 years of the 21st century, drastically increased the demand for fuel around the world and led to rising oil prices. This led to an unexpected revenue windfall for Brazil and other oil exporting countries. So Brazil benefited from this rapid economic development of India and China. But there's also another side of the coin. If you benefit because someone else is growing, then you're also vulnerable to a slowdown in those other countries. And that's exactly what happened following the Great Recession, the onset of the Great Recession. In the United States, the economy began contracting in December of 2007. And then later on, the recession escalated in 2008 with the collapse of housing prices, and it continued until 2009. So this Great Recession that began in the United States but propagated throughout the world has had a significant impact on the decline of growth in India and China. China continues to grow to this day, but at a substantially slower rate. Instead of 9% a year as it was growing between 1980 and 2007, on average it was 9%. Now it's growing at about 7% annual rate. So this led to the decline in demand for energy, and so energy prices fell. And in addition, many new deposits of shale oil and natural gas were discovered during the first decade of the 2000s. A combination of these two factors led to low oil prices and economic pain for Brazil. Brazil's modern economic history has been an alternation between strong economic nationalism, which is called mercantilism, and free enterprise that is open to foreign capital. So depending on who was president, Brazil either allowed a lot of foreign capital in, or it resisted foreign investors coming in. When it comes to trade policy in particular, Brazil generally has been mercantilist, significantly limiting foreign competition, particularly in the industrial sector, so as to champion its domestic industry, for example, its airline industry. And Brazil has the third largest civilian aircraft building industry in the world. Brazil's consumers and businesses became overly leveraged during the first decade of the 21st century. That is to say, they borrowed too much money, and a lot of borrowing took place at exorbitant interest rates, so many of the loans could not be repaid. This led to a credit crunch during the second decade of the 21st century, when even rich people and companies had a very hard time obtaining credit. Brazil's middle class, which had been expanding quite dramatically during the first decade of the 21st century, began to shrink during the second decade. Events like World Cup soccer in 2014 and the Rio Olympics in 2016 have led to significant inflation, dislocation of residents, traffic jams, increase in taxes and bus fares, which led to street demonstrations, protests, and social instability. President Dilma Rousseff, Brazil's first female president, who had in fact been imprisoned by the previous regime, the non-democratic regime, she herself was impeached in mid-2016. That is to say, she was officially accused, and her presidency was suspended. She was suspended as president, and a trial, as of 2016, was about to take place in order to determine whether or not she should be permanently removed from office. At the same time, violent crime is very high in Brazil, and as political turmoil increased, so did violent crime. Even tourist destinations are not altogether safe, not even during daytime. Armed robberies are not uncommon in Brazil during daytime. Some police have been underpaid or unpaid for a very long time because of the budget crisis and political turmoil. Healthcare in many hospitals resembles that of the most extremely poor countries. Corruption is widespread. It's not only at the national government level, but also at the regional government level. So Brazil's problems are legion. The bottom line seems to be that Brazil is a perennial country of the future, but it never seems to fully realize its potential. It's never the superpower of the present, as some predicted it would become. So in the 60s and 70s, a lot of people were predicting Brazil is a future superpower, but it has not happened, not in the military sense, not in an economic sense. Brazil actually had a nuclear program once, but it decided to abandon it in the 1990s. Social and demographic characteristics of Brazil. Now, Brazil is the only Portuguese-speaking country in the Western Hemisphere, and obviously the only Portuguese-speaking country in Latin America. But because of its huge population of over 210 million people, it accounts for almost 40% of all Latin American population. In recent years, an interesting trend has been set in Brazil. The fertility rate has collapsed. It is currently 1.8 children per woman, which is far below the replacement rate of 2.1. This means that without immigration, Brazil's population would soon begin to decline. And even in recent years, its population has been growing basically by inertia because people are living longer, and that's why the population has been increasing. But women have not had sufficient number of children to keep replacing population, to keep it steady in the long run for quite a few years now. So Brazil, like many more advanced and richer countries, is also facing a demographic crisis, but it is facing it under harsher conditions because it is harder for Brazil to attract capital, and it is harder for Brazil to attract young skilled immigrants than it would be, let's say, for countries like the United States or Japan or France. Brazil continues to face economic and social problems in its shanty towns, in the favelas, many of which are controlled by drug dealers as they have been for generations now. It also faces the issue of street children being harassed or even killed by the police or by hired security guards. So the long and the short of it is that lack of credit, the shrinking middle class, persistent poverty, and political instability do not bode well for Brazil's immediate future. The conclusion is that Brazil has not been able to realize the kind of grand economic and political future that many have predicted for it during the 60s, the 70s, and even the 1980s. Its economy is insufficiently modernized and insufficiently diversified for the country of its size. The rule of law is lacking, and there is too much corruption. Brazil's economic weakness and social and political instability mean that Brazil won't be able to challenge the United States for any kind of parity in terms of influence in the Western Hemisphere. And the global role that Brazil plays in politics is going to remain relatively modest for the foreseeable future. Thank you.